what would be the steps that allow a nuclear renaissance to actually come to fruition?
Noticeably absent from that chart is the U.S. and Canada. There are no nuclear power plants under construction in North America right now, and that's despite the fact that there is a lot of interest in building a lot. If you looked at that chart, you see the dominance in red of the APAC nations. China is building 28 reactors. India is building several and has ambitions to build 100 gigawatts more of capacity. So 2/3 of the nuclear construction is going on in the Asia Pacific region. And finally, the most disruptive of the technologies are the fusion technologies, which has yet to be proven, but there's a lot of money flowing into development and commercialization of fusion devices. And if you get a fusion device operating in the next few years, we anticipate seeing a lot more cash flowing into the industry and a lot of interest in deploying that technology.
A company like CHES, for example, or which is the company that is set out to build that new reactor in the Czech Republic, which is just an extension. We sort of were flagging that a big risk for the company was that the company would be tasked to build and to finance this new reactor. And since the company has sort of spun off the risk on the balance sheet and just kept a 20% stake over sort of the funding of the full project, which we see as a positive development.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Barnett, and I'd like to welcome you to today's BI Energy Exchange, where we talk about our research and the latest developments in energy markets. On the call today, we've got Patricio Alvarez joining from his usual perch in Madrid. And then we have a special guest today. We have Chris Gadomski from BloombergNEF. He's the head of nuclear research there, and he just recently put out his outlook, 1H outlook for the global nuclear power industry. And Chris, I want you to give us a breakdown of kind of how you're thinking about things right now. You know, one of your first charts is pretty compelling. Looks like about 61 reactors are under construction here at the moment, much of it in China. So give us a sense, you know, what's going on with the nuclear industry globally? How much are we building right now? And, you know, what do you think is going to get done kind of in the sort of next 5 to 10 years in this space?
Certainly. There's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about the nuclear power industry, and there's a lot of talk about a nuclear renaissance. However, if you talk about chatter discussion, there is a nuclear renaissance. But if you talk about actual construction, one could suggest that perhaps there's not a nuclear renaissance, especially not in North America. Noticeably absent from that chart is the U.S. and Canada. There are no nuclear power plants under construction in North America right now, and that's despite the fact that there is a lot of interest in building a lot. If you looked at that chart, you see the dominance in red of the APAC nations. China is building 28 reactors. India is building several and has ambitions to build 100 gigawatts more of capacity. So 2/3 of the nuclear construction is going on in the Asia Pacific region. What's less apparent in that graph, however, are two things that are sort of hidden in the data. One is that Russia is building 4 reactors in its own country, but it's also building several reactors in China, in India, in Bangladesh, in Turkey, in Egypt, and in Iran. So they've got 23 reactors under construction. So you have tremendous amount of growth and activity by the Chinese and by the Russians. Also less apparent in this graph is that of those 61 reactors, fully 9 of them are in what I call economic or financial trouble. The 2 reactors in Japan have been under construction since before Fukushima, so one has to wonder how that's going to pay off economically if they've been under construction for a very long period of time. The 3 reactors in Ukraine and Slovakia, they are having a race to see which is going to be the longest construction period. And they started building those in 1986 and 1987. And there are projects in the UK, for example, which is they're on a ride to become the most expensive nuclear power project on a kilowatt basis. So one has to question the economic viability of doing more. And finally, you've got two reactors in South America, one in Brazil and one in Argentina. And those are stuck on a stop and go carousel, and there's no real indication when they'll be finished or if they'll eventually be finished. So there's a little bit of weakness in the data suggesting that 61. And that 61 is about halfway between the low of 52 reactors under construction in 2021 and a high of 72 shortly after Fukushima.
Now, Chris, from a sort of armchair quarterback perspective here, I think nuclear has gotten a lot of press attention lately. And I don't think it's really focused on what you just broke down and what you show in your chart. So particularly in America, you're seeing a lot of the tech industry really talk about nuclear as a solution to help fuel AI data centers or power AI data centers. And most of that discussion's around new nuclear technology, SMRs, that sort of thing. So how do you think about the sort of emergent aspect of the nuclear power story? Are we going to see any of that stuff this decade? Are we really, for the time being, much more focused on the traditional reactors?
So there are actually 5 different pathways to putting nuclear electrons on the grid. The first one we covered is the large reactors. The next one down is small reactors, which is just a shrinking from 1,000 gigawatts to 1,000 megawatts, to 300 megawatts. The next level down is advanced reactors, and these incorporate innovations besides the shrinkage of size, whether that's a fast reactor, a high temperature gas reactor, a molten salt reactor. They bring innovations to the industry. You'll be seeing a lot of innovation in oil and gas and renewables, but the innovation in the nuclear industry is just coming to the market now and in the next few years. You go a step below that in level microreactors, and microreactors are less than 50 megawatts and suggest the advantage of quick deployment or so, and easier to deploy because you put them on the back of a tractor trailer or a lorry and deliver them to the site. And then finally, the most disruptive technologies are the fusion technologies, which has yet to be proven, but there's a lot of money flowing into development and commercialization of fusion devices. And if you get a fusion device operating in the next few years, we anticipate seeing a lot more cash flowing into the industry and a lot of interest in deploying that technology. Yes, right now there's a lot of interest in the hyperscalers in the advanced reactor level of deployment. However, it's chump change. They're giving $200, $300 million here, and they haven't really made the commitments that's going to be necessary to drive these things across the finish line.
Yeah, very interesting. One more question before we bring Patricio into the conversation. Just before we kind of kick this call off, we were also chatting a bit about not new nuclear power, but existing nuclear power plants. And, we specifically were talking about Germany and the idea that they exited the space following Fukushima. And I generally get the sense that in some countries, maybe even Spain, for example, where Patricio's at, there does seem to be this trend where possibly nuclear gets walked back from the sort of existing fleet perspective. So, give me a sense, are you optimistic that we're going to hold the line on most of our operating plants globally and in the West, or do you think some of these existing operations will be pressured to close in the same way that the Germany made the decision to exit nuclear.
Are you asking me or are you asking Patricio?
No, I'm asking you, Chris. Well, I'm
Okay.
gonna bring Patricio in next, but I'm curious to get your read on sort of the existing fleet.
There's a lot of interest in bringing back existing or retired reactors because it represents the cheapest and perhaps quickest way to do so. So we're in the U.S. We're bringing back reactors. Three of them have been identified as possible nuclear power plants to bring back. The first one being the Palisades nuclear power plant, which the U.S. government gave about $1.5 billion to bring it back online. And we hope to have that online by the end of this year, beginning of next year. 3 Mile Island #1 was also retired about 5 years ago, and we're talking about bringing that one at a cost of about $2.5 billion. That should come back towards the end of the decade, towards 28, 29. But still, bringing back 1,000 megawatts of carbon-free power for that price seems to be a reasonable investment. And the hyperscalers, specifically, I believe Microsoft or Meta, are very much interested in bringing that reactor back online. And there's another one, Dwayne Arnold, out in the Midwest, which is also a potential candidate for that. Now, we looked at the possibility of bringing back some of the German reactors. You probably have a lot more local opposition to doing so in Germany. Plus, the Germans are very, very diligent, so they decided to close them. So instead of hanging around and fooling around, they went very aggressively towards dismantling those reactors. So it's my understanding that they moved quickly to dismantle them or starting to dismantle them. In the US, we can take up to 60 years to dismantle and retire a nuclear power plant. And that process gives us an opportunity perhaps to bring back some of them. But we've retired 10 or 11 nuclear power plants in the US in the last, since Fukushima. Only 3 of them are probably worthwhile to bring back. Spain is a very interesting situation, is that perhaps, especially in light of the recent developments over there, one of the reading I've done, so there was a lack of inertia in the system, and possibly, spinning turbines could have helped address that. And people have to start taking nuclear away from the concept of it being a competitor to renewables, as opposed to rather being a complement to renewables. And so, if you have a goal line to be carbon free in a certain time frame, nuclear is a very, very relevant part of the equation.
Very interesting, Patricio. Let's get your thoughts here. So what a day to do this. I just saw on the wire a little earlier that there's a story from our colleagues over at Bloomberg News where the Prime Minister of Spain, I don't know if he was sort of joking here in the way he said it, but I like the line where he said, high-earning electricity executives should pay the cost to keep nuclear plants running if they don't want to shut them down. What do you make of that? Is that just rhetoric? And, what's your sense on kind of the positioning of nuclear in Spain and then in Europe more broadly?
Sure. So, the read on the comment, the first comment about the Spanish PM's comments on nuclear, I think they're perhaps, they're not speaking to, let's say, the technical aspect of nuclear. I think I've heard or read other comments where he blamed nuclear for part of the blackout. Because he said that nuclear plants were drawing power at the time of the blackout, which I think maybe he's not getting the right information in terms of like how the blackout occurred and how nuclear could help reduce the volatility in the frequency. Just alluding to what Chris was talking about the inertia. If anything, keeping or extending the operational life of the nuclear reactors in Spain would probably help help prevent future grid failures, or sort of keeping the frequencies more stable when the share of renewables increases so abruptly. Still sort of a mystery as to what was the specific cause of the outage. But at the time of the outage, there was a large share of solar power, and there was a lack of inertia that probably caused some volatility in the frequency. In terms of the broader read, of course, the things that you can actually take away from the PM's comments is that he's saying that the utilities themselves should design a framework to keep operating the nuclear plants. And I don't think, I think that's a bit unheard of in terms of when you look at other European nations, is usually the watchdog that sets the rules of engagement in terms of the operation for the nuclear plants. And the other piece of it, which I think you were right, Robin, in flagging that it might be not a very literal comment, is that taxpayers or ratepayers are already paying for the decommissioning of nuclear plants in Spain. There's a levy that is supposed to fund the decommissioning of these plants, which is set to start in 2027 and go progressively through 2035. So if anything, these plants or the decommissioning costs have already been burdened onto the ratepayers. So it's just, I think, a matter of trying to flesh out and separate this ideology of if you're pro renewables, you're anti-nuclear. I think it's very clear we could use both, and you can throw a bit of grid spending on top as well here in Spain. And on the broader European scale, I think it's very much similar to what Chris showed on the first slide. Outside of China, really, the only two reactors that we have or that are material being built in Europe are the two in the UK. And yeah, those have been facing almost several years of delays and cost overruns that are just, make you question the viability of those projects in their current forms.
Very interesting. Chris, let's get your read on the way to think about cost for nuclear. I mean, in my mind, they're very low OpEx once you get them built. It's all a capital story. So, what do you think? Where's nuclear coming in these days on a levelized cost of electricity? And is there a bifurcation between how you think about it in the West and how you might think about it in a country like China?
So according to the data that we've collected over the last few years, we can build a nuclear power plant in the United States for around $15,000 a kilowatt. And we are sort of betting here in the US that the UK project will exceed that, so they will have the prize for building the most expensive nuclear power plant. If you look at what's going on in China, they're building nuclear power plants for 1/5 the cost, less than $3,000 a kilowatt. And so it makes perfect sense that the Chinese, who are building reactors for 1/5 the cost, are building 28, 29 reactors or so at the present time. And it also makes sense that the US is not building any, because people were very much upset by the price tag of spending $34 billion to build 2.2 gigawatts of capacity over a course of 10 years of construction and 4 years of licensing. What that project has done essentially is scared to death all of the nuclear utilities or utilities around the country that are contemplating building large reactors, because it's essentially a decision to do that will lead, if they are a publicly traded company, to immediate shorting of the stock, because there's very, very little confidence that these new reactors, large reactors, can be built on time and on schedule. And we've seen that already in the project that's going on in the Czech Republic. It started around $17 billion for two. It's up to the $18 billion range. I don't know if that's just a currency issue right now, but however, the price is going up. And we already see obstacles to the that project being thrown at it by EDF, who are bumming out because they didn't get selected for that. But EDF has a very, very poor record of building nuclear projects on time and on budget. So it's understandable that the Czech government went with a consortium that has successfully delivered nuclear power projects close to being on time and on budget in a very hostile environment in the UAE. So people are scared to death to build nuclear power plants in the U.S., and everybody's waiting for somebody else to go next, despite the fact that the U.S. government says that the cost per kilowatt will be 30% less on the next project. But utility is saying, well, let someone else go ahead and do that and show me. And then there's the question of time. If you are driven by time and you need to get these reactors online very, very quickly, is it going to take you 10 years to get the power online? There's so much can happen in the next 10 years that it poses a very, very risky challenge to utilities to go ahead and undertake these projects. However, the SMRs are also, not exactly a proven project at this point. Finally, think about utility owners, the CEOs that run them. A lot of times they're paid in stock or paid on the basis for how well the stock is going to perform over the course of their tenure. And you are undertaking a project which could potentially have very adverse effects on the bottom line and on the stock price. So utilities owners, CEOs have a vested interest to not move and do that. And I ran into this in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was thinking about building nuclear power plants, and the only company that was going to have the wherewithal to be the host company for doing that was Saudi Aramco. They were also at the time thinking about going public. They did go public, and certainly any conversation of a nuclear adventure as part of the future of Saudi Aramco would have had a negative impact on the stock. So a lot of moving parts here to be sort of dealt with.
Patricio, I see you nodding your head, but what do you think? Is nuclear investable from a utility perspective right now? And I'm just thinking about the fact that maybe you can highlight a little bit of the experience with EDF in the past on that front.
Sure. So yeah, I was nodding because I completely agree. I think our view is very similar from looking from an equity research perspective. A company like CHES, for example, or which is the company that is set out to build that new reactor in the Czech Republic, which is just an extension. We sort of were flagging that a big risk for the company was that the company would be tasked to build and to finance this new reactor. And since the company has sort of spun off the risk on the balance sheet and just kept a 20% stake over sort of the funding of the full project, which we see as a positive development, because at the end of the day, like if you take the case of EDF, that's an example of a company that was tasked with building new reactors, which tend to be overrun on costs and on time, on building new ones, and also maintaining a fleet, the largest fleet in Europe of nuclear reactors. So those costs, you could clearly see them on the balance sheet. So EDF kind of struggled to widen the funding capacity to build other things like building renewables or investing more on grids. It was only sort of a big burden on the capex, especially on maintenance for them, which sort of culminated in the nationalization of the company in 2022. Which makes me sort of bring in another aspect of nuclear. Usually nuclear tends to be highly regulated. For example, in the case of EDF, before its nationalization, the government already owned roughly 70% of EDF, which meant that there was the regulation saying that they should use most of, or a quota of, the nuclear output must be sold at a regulated price or a below market price, which during the energy crisis in 2022 led to significant multi-billion EBITDA losses, which ultimately pushed the balance sheet to the brink, and that's what led to the nationalization of the company. And such is the case for most of nuclear power sales in Europe. They tend to be regulated, or they tend to be a certain proportion of the sales need to be set at below market prices, which tends to mean that they're not very, very economical.
So I still think that there is a disconnect perhaps between the reality on the ground and the sort of challenges of doing nuclear and where some of our contemporary thinkers are at. So I saw Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, given a talk relatively recently, and he talks about the need for an energy breakthrough to help power AI. And he particularly often cites nuclear as a potential answer, one of the answers. So, Chris, it seems like if you ask a utility executive, they're going to tell you, hey, nuclear is really tough. I'm not sure I want to do it. But then if you look in the tech community, they're saying, let's go on nuclear. What's the right answer? What do you make of that optimism you're hearing from the tech community? What's really holding back in your mind the potential to see nuclear a renaissance unfold, as you sort of said at the beginning? I think you're sort of skeptical that could happen, but what would be the steps that allow a nuclear renaissance to actually come to fruition?
So let's start with the U.S. In the U.S., we have a lot of, or have had a lot of policy push, but we've had very little market pull, in the sense that we now don't have utilities standing up and says, "I'll take this next reactor," and we see a little bit of that developing with the hyperscalers saying, "Okay, we need some stuff," and we're throwing nickels and dimes and committing to several different technologies in the future. So there's several things that are problematic. First of all is the time frame. Hyperscalers need it yesterday, and the nuclear industry is not going to deliver any new significant capacity in North America until 2030 or so. And nuclear has a history of taking longer and costing more. So if you listen to the most ambitious comments made by the industry, that this is going to be something that they're coming online 28, 29. We calculate 2030, 2031 or so for the first ones. Second issue is for hyperscalers is cost of electricity, and that's a big unknown. No one will give you a firm cost of what these first nuclear power plants will cost. The goal is to get them from the first of a kind cost to the nth of a kind cost relatively quickly. So we're very interested in those companies that are developing a pipeline of projects so that they can raise capital with which to build the manufacturing facilities to turn the production of these advanced reactors similar to the production of a Boeing 737 or so. And that's not happening yet. And then another thing that's very, very important, besides price, is reliability of the power. And these are all first of a kind reactors. And so, yes, you're going to be building a $1 billion data center, and you're going to be trying to hook up a nuclear power plant to that hasn't proved, it hasn't had the operational demonstration that they can run 24/7 for as long period of time. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. But there is a tremendous amount of interest, and from a large number of companies that are all pursuing presently in pre-application discussions with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, hoping to move into application sometime this year. And if they do, that's going to be very, very interesting and good for the industry to see a whole bunch of these running through. But that raises another question: is where is the capital going to come from, and which technology is going to prevail, and who's going to make that technology decision? We have, by some estimates, up to 80 SMR designs, plus you have the fusion companies, which are proliferating like crazy. Not all of them are going to be successful. And that contrasts with the situation in China and Russia, which you almost have the situation where there was picking of winners, where the Chinese decided, okay, we have a high temperature gas reactor, we're going over here, and we have a 100 megawatt light water reactor. In Russia, they're taking the same reactors that operate on their nuclear icebreakers and the floating nuclear power plants to take into line. So there's not all this chaos in which technology is going to prevail. A winner has been chosen. That's what they're going to develop. That simplifies the project and has a maybe not optimal technology going forward, but one technology with a lot of horsepower behind it to get across the finish line.
What's your sense on what regulators can do? Because I think at the start of the Trump administration here, there has been some discussion about nuclear power, and in other areas, they're trying to make it easier to build things. So there's talk about, lessening NEPA reviews on certain kinds of critical infrastructure. But, giving me a sense, I do think that lawyers are a big part of that time frame for why it takes so long to get nuclear built, all the permitting and paperwork and approvals. Is there stuff that can be done to accelerate that?
So there are two licenses that are required. One is to get a standard design approval for the actual technology. This reactor is now licensed by the NRC. Okay. The second license requires a site license, working with the utility, trying to decide where you're going to put this. Now, these advanced reactors, if you have a whole bunch of small ones, that complicates the site licensing process, and it's something that's being challenged now by some of the West Texas developers would like to see nuclear power plants, small ones, help power the Permian Basin. And but it's a question mark. You can have these small advanced reactors popping up like crazy. Where's the licensing for them, and how complicated will that be? And also, where's the security forces that are going to protect these things going to come from, and how expensive that's going to be? The NRC has a very strong background of knowledge on licensing large reactors. So it's easy for them to go from large reactors to small SMRs. Perhaps it's not so easy for them to go to high temperature gas reactors and also to fast reactors and to molten salt reactors, which they have less experience monitoring. So of all the reactors that are in the pipeline to be in the licensing pipeline, some of them fall into the more advanced category. And so I anticipate there's going to be some challenges for the licensing processes.
Very interesting. Recognizing that we're a little over time here, maybe a couple more questions for you, Chris. One, that thing that's on my mind is, this call is very investor oriented, right? Like if you think about who's listening in right now, and so if someone wants to invest in the nuclear power industry, they think it has a bright future, for instance. You can, there are utilities, there's uranium, there's the startups that are trying to build new technologies, there's the equipment suppliers that do the current types of reactors that are out in the marketplace. Do you have any sense on kind of, which types of companies are kind of positioning around the thesis of nuclear growth? How do you think about it from an investment angle? Is there certain areas where you would be more cautious?
I mean, certainly the hyperscaler interest is driving demand for utilities, and also the energy security aspect is something that's on the national level driving interest in nuclear power plants, and certainly the effect that we're producing a tremendous amount of green energy is driving demand. So where are places in the country where all of those things may come together? So we see a lot of interest in Texas, for example. Texas has a state legislature and a state mind frame, I think, that's very, very interested moving forward with nuclear. And so that's a state that we're watching very, very quickly. Virginia has Data Center Alley, tremendous amount of activity over there. They have actually taken steps to, with Dominion Energy Services, to request for a SMR to be built in the northern part of the state, very close to Data Center Alley, and they've got the site for the first Commonwealth fusion system, a commercial device in Chesterfield County sometime in the early 2030s. So those are two areas where it's pretty interesting that they're going to be moving forward. And I understand there are certain states like New York and New Jersey which are trying to develop a plan to also embrace advanced nuclear technologies, but that may be a greater challenge due to the sort of historical opposition to anything nuclear here.
Patricio, you already mentioned the experience with CHES, but what's your sense? Is if a utility has nuclear in the portfolio, is that seen as a positive sign by investors or more of a cautionary sign?
So it will very much depend on the specific regulation for the company. So like, for example, you're mentioning ČEZ. ČEZ, like their power margins are very healthy relative to other European utilities. And one of the main reasons is the high share of nuclear output they have in their mix, because it's, you know, low variable costs, and wholesale prices in Central Europe are mainly set by gas prices. So the wholesale prices are relatively, you know, solid, and variable costs are low. So if you look at ČEZ specifically, the economics work for them, despite the fact that they were hit with a couple of levies specific on extraordinary returns. But other than that, really, the main sort of the main case in Europe continues to be EDF. And since its nationalization, the company has recovered. EBITDA has grown since 2022, albeit, you know, it's uninvestable at the moment because it's nationalized. But the economics work. I would say if the plants are running, the margins are healthy. So that kind of supports the case of extending the life of existing assets, while I would say the long-term future of new reactors remains relatively uncertain, I think.
Yep. If I could comment on the situation in ČEZ, if you go back 11 years ago, there was a proposal to build an additional reactor at the Czech Republic's Temelín facility. That went pretty far down the line. It was ultimately canceled because of the economics not being able to work. And so now we are 10, 11 years later, and you have another large reactor vendor project going forward at a different plant. And you also have ČEZ taking a 20% share in Rolls-Royce SMR, and also committing to building several gigawatts worth of capacity for those reactors. So what we're seeing now, in that I'm looking at very carefully, is you have in several countries around the world, you have this balancing act. Well, do we build large reactors? Do we build small reactors? Or do we build both? And I think that it's a very, very confused situation. And with ČEZ taking 20% of SMR Rolls-Royce and committing to build 6 of those things, you know, how much appetite for advanced nuclear is there in the country to sort of buy, you know, 2.2 gigawatts of large reactors from the Koreans and up to several gigawatts of SMR. So it's a very dynamic and uncertain marketplace right now, which is fascinating to follow. And the same situation can be looked at in Poland, where they're looking at Westinghouse AP1000 reactors and also the General Electric Hitachi SMR. So it's not a clear picture going forward.
Very interesting. Chris, maybe last question here. And I've seen maybe in the last month or so some headlines out of China about thorium reactors. I think it's maybe you can also say molten salt reactor in that's analogous. I'm not really sure. So give me a sense on, you know, this technology. And I saw a big story recently on thorium reserves in China and how this could be the future of nuclear. And since we've got you here on the call, you know, break it down for us. Is that hot air? Is it something that's real? Could this be a new sort of breakthrough in the nuclear space?
You know, if you go back down to 1943 or 1944, when they were developing the nuclear bomb, the thorium was a candidate and quickly discarded because there's no clear pathway to the type of uranium that you need, you know, through that technology. It's much easier to get weapons grade uranium by using the uranium as opposed to thorium, which takes an additional step. So thorium pathway was disregarded early on from a practical application because of the proliferation, greater peripheral proliferation resistance to that technology. And so every once in a while, thorium surfaces as an opportunity that we should consider that. and it sort of gets beaten back down because of the and the reason for thorium was that we don't have enough uranium, but we keep on finding more and more uranium, and I don't think we're at any shortage of uranium in the near term. Plus, some of these advanced reactors that are being developed can consume the spent fuel that has been that is laying around in many sites, and they burn fuel more efficiently. So the call for thorium is for because of a shortage of uranium, and I'm not sure that's going to be a pressing issue in the near term. And then we haven't really talked about fusion. Fusion is the big elephant in the room as far as I'm concerned. You have Germany, for example, which will never build another nuclear power plant, very aggressively pursuing, stellarator fusion technology at the Max Planck Institute. And so I could very easily see Germany, making some progress through that technology. And I visited many fusion facilities around the world, in France, in the UK, in North America or so. And I suggest that people don't discard that technology. It should be something that people look at very, very carefully, because they have attracted a lot more cash than some of the advanced reactor companies now. And they could be moving much quicker to a commercialization. And they don't have a regulatory gauntlet to go through that's as severe as the fission power plants have. And the prototype that's being built in Devens, Massachusetts is 300 meters away from 300 meters away from residential housing. I don't think you can build a fission plant that close to residential housing. So that sort of suggests that there's less safety concerns, less proliferation concerns, no spent fuel concerns. So it's a very disruptive technology. It hasn't been proven yet, and it hasn't been able to produce a commercial device yet, but they're working on that.
In the lab setting, what's the longest fusion reaction that's been sustained? It's gone up quite a bit in recent years, right?
Yes, there's three pathways for, again, talking about pathways. You have the ITER project in south of France, which is the international collaboration. Then you have many national programs in the UK, France, Germany, the US, Tokyo, Korea, Japan, Korea, China. And then you have the private sector. And the first two programs are more focus on the research of finding out how fusion can be made. The private sector are focused on developing commercial power plants. And so the time goes up, but the real thing to watch from a power point of view is how quickly some of these fusion startups, some of them like Commonwealth Fusion has raised $2.2 billion, and they're backed by the Bill Gates of the world, the Bezos of the world, the Sam Altmans of the world. So a lot of these people who have lots of cash are putting money into fusion in hopes that one day they can solve a lot of problems with that. So I'm encouraged by what I see, and I don't believe the old adage that it's 30 years and $30 billion away. It may be $30 billion away, but certainly not 30 years away.
Fantastic. Well, let's have you back on well in advance of 30 years, so we can get a check-in on the progress of fusion and just the general nuclear power industry. Yeah. Very fascinating, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for everyone still listening, we hold these calls every Wednesday at 10 a.m. New York, 3 p.m. London. Feel free to spread the word and join us every week. We try to make it interesting. And so take care. See you next week. Cheers.
Thank you.